This is Audible.
My name is Steve Abrams. I am chair of the State Board of Education and also chair of the Science Subcommittee. My fellow board members with me here on the subcommittee are Mrs. Connie Morris and Mrs. Kathy Martin. The purpose of the hearings that will be held over the next several days is to assist us as board members in understanding the complex and oftentimes confusing issues regarding science education. A brief history of how we arrived at these hearings may be helpful. In June of last year, a statewide committee appointed by the Commissioner of Education and comprised of 26 public and private educators spanning elementary, primary, secondary, and post-secondary levels, retired educators, curriculum coordinators, and a private practice physician began the process of reviewing and revising the state science standards. The writing committee met several times between June and November and presented a draft of the standards to the state board in December of 2004. At the same time, 8 members of the writing committee submitted what is now referred to as the minority report, asking the state board to consider some changes to the draft. Through much discussion at the state board, a subcommittee, the 3 of us, was formed to further examine the issues contained in the minority report. Also, after much discussion, it was decided that the best forum to address the issues was via hearings such as these we'll have over the next several days. In order to conduct the hearings in a reasonable time frame and in a civil manner, there are a few house rules and procedures that you, the audience, and indeed all of us need to be aware of. First, we're on a very tight schedule. We have more than 20 experts appearing before the subcommittee, and within the next 3 days, it is critical that we stay on schedule. In order to do this, I request that no comments come from the audience. The expert witnesses have come from quite a distance to present their information. We should allow them every courtesy. We ask that you do not display signs of support or opposition by yelling, applause, and so forth. We would also ask that each of you turn off your cell phones, please. Each expert's testimony has been given an allotted amount of time as determined by the presenters. Following the expert's presentation, the legal counsel for the opposing viewpoint will be given half that amount of time to ask questions. Following that, we, the subcommittee members, will be given half of that time to ask questions. For example, if an expert testifies for 20 minutes, the opposing counsel will be given 10 minutes for questioning, and the subcommittee members will be given 5 minutes for questioning. The time for questions will be adhered to. Therefore, the questions should be succinct and not sound like a speech. We'll take one 10-minute break this morning at 10:40, break for lunch at 12, resume at 12:55 with another 10-minute break at 3:30, and adjourn for the day at about 5:30. We'll follow the same schedule for the next 2 days and also on Thursday, May 12. If you leave for the day, we'd ask that you please give your name tag to the KSDE staff at the tables outside the auditorium. Additionally, please note that Memorial Hall does not allow food or drink in the auditorium. We would ask that you kindly abide by this policy. Before we begin, I'd like to make some introductions. Right here to my immediate right is Mr. Pedro Irigoyen and Mr. Evan Kreider. Their legal counsel for the mainstream viewpoint. On the other side, just facing me, is Mr. John Calvert, legal counsel for the members who wrote the minority report, and assisting him is Dr. Bill Harris and also Mr. Edward Sison. Additionally, a court reporter is recording all of the proceedings, and a transcript will be made available to the public at a later date. Thus, to those that are speaking, speak clearly. Also, if she has problems and she's going to notify us, we're going to ask you to slow down or to repeat and try not to talk on top of each other. I thank you for your interest in Kansas education. Thank you. Mr. Calvert, I'll turn you for the first witness.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, authors of the minority report, and members of the writing committee, Mr. Irigoyen, members of the press and the public, I want to thank you for this opportunity for the public and the committee to view the scientific reasons for the minority report and the basis for it. I would like to introduce briefly my colleague, Mr. Ed Sisson is a lawyer with Arnold and Porter from Washington, D.C., and came all the way out here to assist. Unfortunately, Ed's job was to examine the opposition witnesses, which we know now will not be with us. So he is assisting me today. At this time, I would like to go immediately into the examination of our witnesses. I'm going to save any of my remarks about the proceeding for my testimony, which will be expected at the end of the proceedings on Saturday. Also, Dr. Harris, who is our first witness, Dr. William Harris, will provide a brief overview as to what our witnesses are expected to show to the public and to the committee. Dr. Harris.
Thank you all for having us here and for this hopefully very interesting 3 to 4 days that we're going to be sharing together. I want to begin by discussing what I think we would like to accomplish with these hearings, at least from our perspective. First of all, we hope to show that there is a scientific controversy over two major aspects of evolutionary theory. Chemical evolution, that is the arrival of life from non-life, and macroevolution, which is the development of complex life forms from simple life forms. Those two issues, I think, are what's on the table. What's not on the table is what we call, and many call, microevolution, also part of Darwin's theory that species adapt to changes in environments by natural processes only, and this occurs within certain limits. The question is, what are the limits? So we anticipate demonstrating that there really is a scientific controversy. Secondly, we want to make the point that this controversy has profound implications for religion and philosophy. If this did not have implications for religion, this room would be far emptier today. Because it impacts religion, and the reason that this issue does impact religion is because we're dealing with what we call origin science. Origins, the beginnings. Where did things come from? Where did we come from? Where did life come from? These are issues which every major religion in the world has a story to tell. They all have a perspective. That's part of that faith. When the state, via public education, asserts an answer to that question from a scientific or whatever point of view, they have entered a religious arena. They are offering an answer that may be in harmony, may be in conflict with religious issues, religious perspectives, and because of that, we now have a religious issue being in the public education system. I think part of our overall goal is to remove the bias of religion that is currently in schools. We have an obligation, we think, to teach origin science in the most neutral way possible, without religious bias, without naturalistic or philosophical bias. And that way we do the best science and we end up neutral with respect to the Constitution. In order to accomplish that, we require that all the data that's relevant, the scientific data that's relevant to the issues of chemical evolution and macroevolution, be put on the table. That the presentation of one side of that controversy, data supporting one side of that controversy, without the presentation of data that's contradictory to that hypothesis, is not scientifically acceptable and also biases the discussion. So in a word, our hope is that at the end of these hearings, we will be allowed to teach the controversy that does exist over origins. It will also remove a tension that's present in classrooms across the state to varying degrees. Parents have perspectives on origins, teachers have perspectives, children have perspectives, administrations have issues. And there is a tension regarding this particular area, like perhaps no other, that needs to be resolved. And we think that our suggestions in the minority report will go a long way toward addressing that tension and allowing an open, even-handed perspective on these issues. This is already, Kansas actually is not the first to do this. Ohio, a couple of years ago, the state of Ohio accepted standards for their public education that allow critical analysis of evolutionary theory. I would note that there still is bioscience alive and well in Ohio, despite that event. There are still graduate students in school in Ohio, despite that. The Minority Report does not introduce religion into this discussion. This is not to introduce creationism. Creationism, of course, is the view that, the way it is traditionally held, a literal understanding of the first 9 chapters of Genesis. That is not what we're interested in. I'm not interested in having religious perspectives applied to science education. I just want the data to speak as it speaks. In my view, the data are not clearly in support of the current naturalistic worldview. The Minority Report does not mandate the teaching of intelligent design. Intelligent design is not a code word for creationism. Teaching the arguments against evolution is not a code word for creationism. It is simply good science education. At this point, however, we do not think it's appropriate to mandate the teaching of intelligent design. It's a fairly new science, the modern science of intelligent design. It's a maturing science. In time, perhaps it would be there, but at this point, we think mandating it is inappropriate. We do not, on the other hand, think that it should be forbidden, that if a student or a teacher feels interested or wants to bring up the issue didactically in a science setting, that should be up to them, and they should be allowed to do that if they want to do that. The strategy of our opponents has been to mischaracterize our position and actually to malign some of us who are presenting that position. They have consistently and remarkably, in my mind, refused to engage in a discussion of the scientific substance of the issue. They continually avoid actually addressing the questions of the data regarding the origins of life experiments, the data regarding the difficulties, the actual fact that it's never been shown that a single-celled prokaryote can convert to a single-cell eukaryote. There is no mechanism known, but yet that is the theory, and that is the way it is taught, in fact, in school. The evidence does not support it, and it disturbs me that we do not discuss the science. All we discuss is people's opinions, and sometimes those of us who are presenting this position are characterized and labeled, unfortunately. The fact that this hearing is not going to be 6 days, again, is remarkable to me, because our opponents have 3 days in which to spend to educate the citizenry of Kansas, to educate the board on what the overwhelming evidence is for their position. They've chosen not to take that opportunity because, in my view, this is just my opinion, they are concerned that when held to the light of public scrutiny, it will be clear that the emperor is not very well dressed. Our opposition has chosen to fight this battle with name-calling, ad hominem attacks, instead of discussing the science. Mr. Calvert, do you have a display I'd ask you to put up?
Dr. Harris, I believe you provided copies of this to the members of the committee.
This is a posting on the Kansas Citizens for Science website, dated February 10th, 2005. It was written by Liz Craig, who is a member of that organization and involved with some of the public relations. It is a discussion with someone named Pat, who I don't know who that is. In this discussion, she points out what the strategy, she says, my strategy at this point. Of course, Kansas Citizens for Science is the organization principally that's opposing our Minority Report. My strategy at this point is the same as it was in 1999. Notify national and local media about what's going on and portray them, not the media, the opponents, in the harshest light possible as political opportunists, as evangelical activists, as ignoramuses, as breakers of rules, as unprincipled bullies, etc., and I'm glad she stopped. There may be no way to head off another science standards debacle, but we can sure make them look like asses as they do what they do. Our target is the moderates who are not that well educated about the issues, not that well educated. We're talking about education here. Most of whom probably are theistic evolutionists. There's no way to convert the creationists. Our witnesses will be in front of you the next few days, and you will be able to see and hear for yourself, and you will be able to judge. Are witnesses political opportunists? I think not. They are advocating a point of view that about 80% of the public in the United States believes in. When polls have been taken, about 80% of those responding favor a balanced view, teach both sides, present all the data. Now, this country is not 80% one political party or another. So that's got to include Republicans and Democrats. Is that me? Okay. So I don't think this is political opportunism. Are they evangelical activists? Well, some, like myself, do have a religious belief. All of us are dissenters from Darwinism. Some of us don't have religious beliefs. All of us are professional scientists who have really committed, I think as most scientists are, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of its religious implications. That is the crux of science. Are we ignoramuses? Well, you'll have to decide. Are we rule breakers? Well, yes, we are. In a sense, we are rule breakers. We are willing to break the unwritten rule of science that says only natural explanations are allowed. When natural explanations are proven by scientific experiment to be inadequate, we are happy to break the rule and to follow the evidence where it goes. Are we unprincipled bullies? The dictionary definition of a bully is a blustering, quarrelsome, overbearing person who habitually badgers and intimidates smaller and weaker people. You may see some bullying on here on these next few days. You'll have to decide who's doing the bullying. The motivation of our witnesses is to follow the evidence, to open up the study of the origins of nature to scientific explanations, whether these are currently defined as natural or not. And that is what I hope we will accomplish.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Would you please describe to the committee and the public a bit about your background and professional experience?
Yeah, I have a PhD in nutritional biochemistry received from the University of Minnesota in 1978. I had an undergraduate degree in chemistry from Hanover College in Indiana. I went to high school in Prairie Village, Shawnee Mission East High School. My postdoctoral work was done in the area of cardiovascular disease and nutrition at the Oregon Health Sciences University for 4 years with Dr. William Connor. After that, I moved in the mid-1980s back to Kansas City to take a job at the University of Kansas Medical Center in the Department of Medicine, running the lipid research laboratory there in the Division of Clinical Pharmacology. And in 1996, I moved to the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and St. Luke's Hospital, where I have the Daniel Lauer Missouri Endowed Chair in Metabolism and Vascular Research. I also serve as the chairman of the Ethics Committee at our hospital.
Have you published papers?
I published a few papers. I published about 90 peer-reviewed studies in the medical literature.
What is your interest? Could you tell us a little bit about what your focus is?
In my day job?
Yes.
I thought I had a day job. My interest is in the prevention of heart disease by nutritional approaches. My particular interest is in fish oils, omega-3 fatty acids. I've been a fan of omega-3 fatty acids for many years. We have discovered, I think, in our research and others that higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids from fish in the blood are a profound risk factor for reduced risk for sudden cardiac death, and we are continuing our studies now to document that a blood test of omega-3 fatty acids should be added to cardiovascular risk panels, just like they measure your cholesterol and your triglycerides and LDL, they ought to measure your omega-3 because it's a fantastic indicator of risk for heart attacks. That's what I do.
Do you also supervise a laboratory that engages in that research?
Right, right. My laboratory contains about 14 individuals. We do that type of research. We also do clinical trials in the area of lipids, diabetes, and metabolism for pharmaceutical industry. We currently are conducting about 25 studies in human volunteers.
Have you received grant monies and so forth to support your research over the years?
Yes, we receive support from the pharmaceutical industry to do these clinical trials that are mandated by the FDA. And I have received grants from the National Institutes of Health, three grants to pursue my work on lipids and omega-3 fatty acids, and several smaller grants from American Heart Association and some foundations.
And about what would be the total?
Total dollars?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, somewhere between $3 and $4 million.
And how would, if you were to put that on a scale, and you were to put on the scale all researchers, how would that compare?
It's not bad.
Okay. Could you tell us, Bill, if you had to describe your primary contribution to the work, the science you're doing now, what would that be?
Well, I think my work, I'm this is a bad joke, I'm a big fish in a little pond in the area of fish research, fish oils. Having been in it since the late 70s, I'm pretty much recognized as a world expert in the omega-3 world and in cardiovascular health in that area. So I'm doing really well in a really small field.
Would it be fair to say that you're the inventor of the test, the omega-3 Omegametrics test?
True.
That actually allows somebody to measure the level of omega-3s in the blood, and from that information have an appreciation for their relative risk for a heart attack?
Yeah, that's what I've done most recently.
How is it that, and I guess you're also lead guitarist and singer in a band, is that right?
You didn't say you were going to ask me. I am part of a small rock and roll band, that's true. I did not bring enough CDs today.
Okay. And how many CDs have you produced?
About 16. When you don't have to write the music, it becomes pretty fast.
Okay.
Just pirating. But we don't sell them, okay, so there's no copyright issues here.
Okay. What is it that caused you to develop a critical thinking about evolution? Tell us about that.
When I was in my graduate work, I did my PhD work at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. At that time, pretty much through college and into my graduate work, I was an agnostic. I grew up a Presbyterian, but that didn't last past high school very well. And so when I got to college and into graduate school, my faith lapsed rather quickly. Later on in graduate school, I met a girl who I was interested in. She was interested in taking classes on the Bible. Well, I haven't really looked at the Bible since I was a teenager. Maybe I ought to look at it and maybe get a little better look at her as well. And ended up marrying her 27 years ago. But through that experience, I had I think a new look at Christianity, and I became a Christian. So my worldview changed at that point. And although I was not, in my research, I was not doing anything that had to do with evolution. I was studying really what almost all sciences study, which is what I call operational science. How does the world operate today? How does it work? Not where did it come from, but how does it work? In that work, I had no need for evolutionary theory or paradigms. So it never really occurred to me to think about it. But when my worldview changed, I started getting interested in looking. So I think my change caused me to get interested in the topic of origins, and I started reading about it. And began to see that what I thought was good evidence, because everybody believed it, was the tremendous leaps of faith that were being taken in the absence of scientific data. And it began to strike me as this is not the way you do science. When you don't know, you say you don't know. You don't make up a story and say that's the way it was. And so you start to get mad a little bit when you see people messing with science. In my own field in omega-3, I have that same issue with people that I think misrepresent the data to have it say what it doesn't really say. So that's how I became interested, mid-'70s, late '70s, and didn't really do anything with it. Read some books, became more engaged in the early '90s when I read Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial. Then I read Mike Behe's book, The Biochemical Challenge to Darwinian Evolution. I found that compelling, and it made a lot of sense. And here we are.
What was it about Phil Johnson's book that pricked your interest?
For me, he made it very clear that science has become a naturalistic philosophy. What I thought science was simply the unbridled search for the truth using, objective means, experiment, hypothesis testing, what we all know is science. But it became clear that when it came to this area of Darwinian evolution, particularly chemical evolution, macroevolution, those two big pieces of evolutionary theory, that there was a tremendous lack of data, and it was the stories were driven by a philosophy that said everything had to have a natural explanation. You can't let anything non-natural get in. And I said, well, we don't know that. We don't know that's the truth, and so it makes sense to me that you'd say we don't know, but as Johnson points out, in the academy, at higher levels of universities, etc., that this is taken as dogma, and dogmas have no place in science, in my view.
Is there a name for that bias?
The fancy name is methodological naturalism. And I haven't ever counted the syllables, but I don't ever want to say it again. I'll just call it naturalism. But basically, it's the use of the way it's typically presented is that scientists use the methods of natural investigation. They don't invoke spiritual forces to account for what they observe in the world. They look for natural causes. And I think that's fine to look for natural causes. But when you don't find any natural causes, it's time to fess up and say we don't know. Instead of saying, well, there was a natural cause, we don't know what it was, but we have faith that that's what happened. So methodological naturalism really puts blinders, I think, on the search for truth, particularly in the area of origin science.
Why in the area of origin science?
Because that's a historical science. It doesn't get much more historical than billions of years ago. Nobody was there to know what happened. Nobody watched it. We cannot say with any surety how anything came to be. Every experiment, particularly in the origin of life field, where they've attempted to use, quote, natural environments to produce even some of the simplest chemicals of life, have consistently failed. Since 1950s, they have failed and failed and failed and failed, and yet they are still in the textbooks presented as the plausible explanation for how life arose. But those experiments have failed. It's dishonest, in my view, to portray failures in the laboratory as successes in a textbook. So methodological naturalism forces that view, in my understanding.
How does it affect the testing of the evolutionary claim?
Well, you can't test the evolutionary claim because there's only one answer. In historical sciences, you have to have at least two possible explanations for what you're trying to explain. How did that happen in the past? You look for clues that are left over in the present, recognizing, and you should recognize, that you may not have all the relevant clues in the present to make your decision about what happened in the past. The clues you may have are going to be incomplete. Therefore, your conclusion about what happened has got to be tentative. And again, you generally have two competing hypotheses to explain what happened. Again, we're talking about origins, where things came from. And if you had, and then you look to see which the data support better. That's the way it typically goes. Of course, there could be a third hypothesis that you didn't even think of that is the truth, and you would have missed it. So if you have a naturalistic point of view and apply to historical sciences, you immediately eliminate the other option that some, what we would now call non-natural process was involved. And we don't know that's the case. But if you assume that from the beginning, you know where you're going to end up before you even start. And again, that's a philosophical stricture around science. Historical science, I don't think is appropriate.
How does that, you explain how the rule, which you mentioned, affects the scientific conclusions. How does it affect the religious issue?
If you only have one solution allowed to the question of where did we come from, and the answer to that question is, in broad strokes, we came by some naturalistic, undirected, unguided process that essentially is an accident. This has been clear. Jacques Monod, the Nobel Prize winner, says man has to understand that he is merely an accident. Now, I understand that many of us in this room may be accidents, okay? But not in the sense he was talking about. That view is a naturalistic worldview that presumes that undirected, unplanned causes were at work from the very beginning, and what we have here today on Earth is simply luck acted upon by law. We're just lucky to be here. It's just a chance thing. Now that, of course, is an explanation for origins, where we came from, that I said every religion has a statement about, has a view about. They're not all the same, of course, but they all weigh in on that issue. And if science weighs in with a one perspective only, based on a philosophy that says it had to be by natural processes, otherwise it's not science, then they're presenting data that's, I think, philosophically driven, not scientifically and data driven. And so that's a problem, and you run into an immediate religious conflict.
Okay. I want to bring you back to...
Can I get a drink of water while you think about that?
Sure.
That's the way the water is going to work today, folks.
Dr. Harris, you are representing yourself and 7 other authors of the Minority Report. Are they... would you like to introduce some of your colleagues that are here today?
4 of my colleagues that were able to come. Greg Lassie, raise your hand. Okay. Wayne Stringer, Dick Unruh, and John Yost. Thank you for coming, guys. There are 2 others who could not make it today. Rick Reeser was unable to come, and Dr. Tim Crater had patients today, so we could not make it.
Could you explain, how you got involved in working on Kansas Science Standards, and a little bit about the process?
I got involved in kind of well, certainly not as directly as I am now. In 1999, when the board was considering science standards back then, I saw what was happening in the newspaper. I decided I'd write a letter about my opinion that it really should be a balanced view, that we shouldn't a priori eliminate by definition one perspective on origins. Through a series of events, I ended up coming over to Topeka, just down the road here, at one of the public comment times. I gave my 2-minute talk right after you did, John. And then I left after my 2-minute talk, and you followed me out of the room and said, we have some things in common, let's talk. And at that point, you as a lawyer with a background in geology and me as a scientist, we thought we had something to bring to the table. And so we, along with Jody Sjogren, who was a zoologist, who we also met through the hearings, formed Intelligent Design Network and made some kind of Johnny-come-lately suggestions to the board regarding how we thought objectivity ought to guide science education. The horse was pretty well out of the barn at that point. So our suggestions generally fell on deaf ears. In 2001, we made some suggestions again following the same theme. So I got a little bit inculcated in this idea of science standards back in 99 or 2001. In 2004, in the summer, I was contacted by Mr. John Bacon from the State Board and asked if I would be willing to serve on the Science Writing Committee. I said, sure, with some trepidation, not knowing we'd end up here. And began, that's where I met my colleagues here and 20-some other members, of educators, scientists, professors from around the state who met in Salina on a monthly basis. And we began hammering through science standards and found that we really had quite a congenial time of it most of the time until we hit some rocky areas, and that's this particular area here. I'd say probably 95% of the standards we are in absolute harmony. It's this particular issue of origins and how it's to be presented that's been the sticking point. I knew Dr. Jay Nicholson, who I forgot to mention is not here as well. He was the 8th member. I knew Jay from 1999. He was, again, on the Science Writing Committee. As we got together and talked, we found that each of us knew other people who shared our views, and that's how pretty much the 8 of us came together over time. Over several meetings, we found that we agreed on how origins ought to be presented, and we saw that we were a minority. So we just began having discussions about what proposals we can bring to the table that would correct what we think were the deficiencies in the science standards as they were being proposed by the majority. And so that's really how we came to be, and we've continued through that.
Tell us a little bit about the way in which you processed your proposals.
Well, our proposals began, I think, I guess you'd say they were actually born in 1999. When you and I and Jody and others in IDNet looked at the science standards at that time and made suggested changes. And so that was somewhat the baby that came with me to the science standards meeting in 2004. And that was the framework around which we built and kept modifying and addressing issues that came up. So what we now call the minority report, at the time it was originally submitted, we didn't know if it was a minority or not, but now we know it is. Okay. That report is simply a collation of the specific pages out of the draft science standards that we would like to see changes in, specific wording that we would like to see changes. And we just put that all together into one document and called it the minority report, submitted it to the board for their consideration.
Why did you just submit it to the board?
Just to the board? We didn't just submit it to the board. Actually, we submitted it to the Science Writing Committee several times in a variety of forms. In written form, in August and September, we submitted, hand out 25 copies of our proposals. In October, we submitted it as well. When it came to the end of October, there was a meeting on the 28th. I was out of town, unable to be there, but my colleagues put into motion on the floor a motion to discuss formally at the committee level all the proposals that we've been circulating. For procedural reasons, the chair ruled that out of order, and we did not get a vote on the minority report. The report at that point, we had hoped to be able to find out if there were others that shared our views, but without a vote, we really couldn't know. So eventually, at the next meeting, we went through it step by step, and at the urging of, I think, of this committee, and discovered that yes, indeed, in several of the cases we were a minority. Some of the things we recommended were accepted.
You mentioned that you formed Intelligent Design Network, and you are managing director of IDNet.
Yeah.
I want to show you, and I believe you've handed to members of the committee the brochure that IDNet has been using for the past 4 or 5 years. And on the front of the cover is an image. There we go. Would you explain briefly what the mission of that organization is about?
Right. The mission of Intelligent Design Network has from the beginning been seeking institutional objectivity, emphasize objectivity and institutional in origin science. The image that we use is simply a balance. And the idea is to place the evidence for a design in one of the pans, place the evidence for undirected blind evolution, or no design, which is essentially what evolution is, in this pan, and see how the data weighs. And don't come to the balance with any religious preconceptions, don't come with any naturalistic preconceptions, and simply let the data fall where they will, and then allow the implications to be as they are. This balance is objective. It's not got one side. It should not be heavier than the other. That's the way we want to do science. Institutional objectivity, everybody has their own personal biases, and you can't get around that. And scientists need to recognize their own biases and put them away when they're doing their work. But institutions of science can have biases as well. And public education is an institution. Public science education is an institution, and we think it should not have any biases the way Origins is presented. So that's what the institutional has to do with it.
Why is it important for the institution to have no bias?
Well, it's kind of like a football game. If the institution is if the school is like a football game that appoints a teacher to be sort of a referee among ideas that he or she is going to be presenting to the classes in a variety of different disciplines. And you've got, if the teacher is unable to or is biased toward one team or the other that's on the field, then you're not going to end up with a good outcome. Nobody would tolerate a football game where the referee was obviously biased. In the same sense, in origin science, an institutional bias from the top can produce unsatisfactory results.
And this is I think you testified, has an unavoidable impact on religion.
Yes.
Can you give us, you've handed to the committee a copy of the Humanist Manifesto. Could you explain how the tenets of that religion influence or impacted by the origin story that you just showed on the scale, the design, no design image?
Yeah, well, sure. The Humanist Manifesto, this is taken from their website last week. Humanism is a progressive, I don't remember it, only read it. Progressive philosophy of life without supernaturalism. So it begins with the philosophy that there is nothing beyond nature. So to me, that's a bias that you just begin with, because you don't know that to be a fact. You just assume it to be a fact. So right away, we're outside the realm of science here. They're not doing good science. They do say things I'm happy with. The knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Best method for it is using the knowledge to develop and help solve problems. I think here's an interesting statement, and this is again, this I think is a clear reflection of the fundamental point that humans are an integral part of nature, the result of an unguided, unplanned evolutionary process, evolutionary change. This is the foundation of current evolutionary theory. Many times I think evolutionary theory is presented to the public as meaning change over time, and that's that. And nobody has any problem with change over time. Everybody agrees that change over time has happened. If that is all evolution is, the room would be empty. Unfortunately, evolutionary theory is not just that things changed over time, but they changed over time by total accident. Everything that we see today simply showed up by the random interaction of matter and energy, law and luck, and that is how we all got here. That is what is at issue. That particular piece of evolutionary theory, and that is what we think children need to know is the definition of evolution. Not just that things changed over time, because that's the part that's particularly contradictory.
The manifesto is signed by a number of different people. Could you point out anybody in particular that's embraced this particular philosophy that's relevant to the discussion?
There are people that some folks would recognize. Richard Dawkins, a professor of public understanding of science at Oxford, who is a avowed avowed evolutionist who fights very hard against folks like us. Anthony Flew is an interesting story. Dr. Flew is a philosopher of science who just last month decided that he was going to follow the evidence wherever it went, and he decided that he was not an atheist anymore. He wants his name taken off this because he is not an atheist. He's not a theist. He says, I don't believe in that personal God stuff, but he says the evidence of design in the world is overwhelming. I can no longer say that this just happened by chance. Eugenie Scott is also, she's the director of the National Center for Science Education. She is one of the leaders of the opposition to our point of view. She is a signatory to that document.
Did Mrs. Scott have any input into the Kansas Science Standards?
Mrs. Scott did have some input in the Science Kansas Standards. I did not know this. Of course, this was not made clear to anybody at the meetings, but it was interesting when Draft 2 was sent out to the full committee for us to see what the final document was. There were buried, if you turn on your track changes, turn on your comments, buried in draft 2 of the Science Education Standards.
This is the March 9, 2005 draft.
Right. If you look here, mission statement. We're in the mission statement area. If you hover your mouse, you all know how this works. You hover your mouse over a comment and the person who made the comment, on whose computer the comment was made. I will not say that Eugenie Scott necessarily made these comments, but somebody got access to her computer and made comments on this document. So this phrase is a good one to retain from the 2001 standards, as remains useful if the ideers make a move. That's us. We're the ideers. And there are several other yellow spots. There's about 9 comments that are in this document that have Eugenie Scott's fingerprints on them. So she did have input into the science standards in Kansas.
Dr. Harris, would you, we've heard about intelligent design and it's discussed in this debate. And although the minority report does not propose that that concept be taught or tested, it is relevant because the minority report suggests that it is an idea that should not be prohibited.
Correct? Correct.
Would you explain why you believe what it is that you believe should not be prohibited?
Well, what is basically intelligent design?
Yes.
Well, I guess at its core, the way I would describe it is sort of by contrast. In my view, and I think this is true, evolution really is a claim, evolutionary theory, Darwinian evolutionary theory, is a claim that all of the apparent design in life, and everybody recognizes that things look like they're designed, but that it is only apparent, that it is only an illusion, that really a law and luck, chance, and chemical interactions are really responsible for all this, what looks like design, but it really isn't design, because design has intent and purpose and is put together with forethought. That's a long definition. Intelligent design is simply a scientific disagreement with that perspective.
And what's the disagreement based on?
Data.
What is the data?
The data is the tremendous amount of data in scientific literature, particularly in biochemistry, but also in cosmology and many other places, that points, that has identified, I think, certainly since 1953, when DNA was, the code was cracked by Watson and Crick. What Watson and Crick discovered was a code. They discovered a code. Every other code in the world that we know of came from a mind. To conclude that DNA at some level somewhere originally came from a mind is not an irresponsible deduction from the data. When we look at some of the biochemical machines that are in cells, and some of our witnesses will attest to this, and maybe even show some pictures. And now that we understand how some of these fantastically complex machines that work inside the simplest cells, we can see them now. We understand them now. the advance in modern molecular biology has shown us a world that can only be explained, in my view, by positing some kind of a plan in a direction. I don't know who did it. I don't know how it was done. I don't know why it was done. I don't have to know any of that stuff to detect design. If I walked into my garage today and I found a 6-foot bacterial flagellum laying there and spinning at 100,000 RPM, I would have no idea what it was, besides maybe my weed whacker gone nuts. But I would have no question in my mind that it was a designed object. I would just not know what it was. But you can infer design just by examining something without knowing anything about where it came from.
Does an inference of design entail a belief in a supernatural?
Of course not. Of course not. Everything you see in this room was designed by an intelligence for a purpose. That's not supernatural. When we're talking, where supernatural comes into it is when we're talking about prehistory, origins. Where did we come from? As far as we know, there weren't any intelligences there. So in that situation, you don't know if there was intelligence involved by direct observation. All you can do is look at the effects of what were left behind. In the same way that an archaeologist finds a stone and says, is this a tool or is it a rock? They're looking for an inference to design based on the data without knowing anything about the originator of that artifact. In the same way in biology, bringing that same thinking mentality into biology, when we find what look like designed objects, to me, the onus is on those who would say it is not designed. Let me show you how that can happen by data, by scientific experiment. Let me show you how that can happen without any planning. That's great. When I see the data, I'll believe it. Until that happens, the onus is on them to show it. Otherwise, design is the natural inference and should remain.
Will science ever be able, from a scientific standpoint, ever be able to prove that life is designed or not designed?
No. You can't prove anything that happened in history. You can only find the inference to the best explanation you got and hold it tentatively. If all the data in the world went that direction, it still would not prove that's what happened.
So ID is simply a scientific inference that competes against another one.
Right.
And
against the materialist inference, right.
Okay. What do you mean by the word prove?
What do I mean by the word prove? You really can't even do that in science. You can't. You can reach a consensus of the data that is overwhelmingly compelling that cannot be explained any other way, and that's probably as close as we get in operational science to proving. I mean, I can't really prove gravity exists, but it seems to work every time I try it. Mm-hmm. So prove, if you're going to be philosophical, and we certainly have philosophers of science who will be up here, you can ask that question too. Mm-hmm.
How do you differentiate science from religion?
Well, religion's fundamentally based on dogmas that are unquestionable. You want to just accept the view of whatever religion you're talking about and says that's the way it is. And data is, to some extent, irrelevant.
So when we looked at the Secular Humanist Manifesto, we were looking at dogmas there, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
If you assume from the outset there's no supernaturalism, well, that's an assumption. That's dogma. That's not provable.
And I think you previously mentioned in your opening about why you don't believe it's appropriate to include it in the standards now.
Yes, I did. I think it's still a developing and maturing field that needs to be fleshed out. There's no curriculum developed for it at this point. There's just a lot of infrastructure, I think, that needs to be put together. The inference is obvious to me. I mean, it's very simple. But the way you actually get it into science standards and then get it into classrooms, there's a tremendous amount of work that's involved there. I don't think we're ready to do that at this point.
Dr. Harris, what I would like you to do is to explain to the committee and the public the work that go through the proposals in the Minority Report. And then also I believe that there were 12 scientists that submitted reviews of those proposals, and I would also like you to talk about that. And I believe you've handed to the committee an exhibit that will perhaps aid your presentation, and I will turn the pages as you direct me.
Yeah. This will not perhaps help. This will be a tremendous help. this is part of the necessary beginning of this thing to lay out what the actual proposals in the minority report are without reading all 19 pages of it, which many of you have. So I have in this table an overview. Over here is the section of the report where it's found. Introduction, this would be grade 8 through 12. S stands for standard. BM stands for benchmark. Okay, so this is where they are in the standards. This is the issue summarized, and then this is a brief description of the issue that we've raised. The first issue that we recommended is that in the mission statement, the word informed be added, that we would aim to equip students to make informed and reasoned decisions. The current standards say equip students to make reasoned decisions. I think that if a decision is poorly informed, it's not going to be well reasoned. And you can come to the wrong conclusion if you haven't got good information. We ask that this two words, informed and, be added to the standards. The committee voted it down, which totally amazes me. But they did. Okay. Secondly, we have proposed to replace a naturalistic definition of science, which was instituted in 1999 in Kansas, with a more traditional definition that we've taken from the Ohio Academy of Sciences that was approved by that State Board of Education. And that one I can't do from memory, but I think I need to read. The current standards read that science is the human activity of seeking natural explanations for what we observe in the world around us. We would suggest that change to science as a systematic method of continuing investigation that uses observation, hypothesis testing, measurement, experimentation, logical argument, and theory building to lead to more adequate explanations of natural phenomena. That is the recommendation that we would make, that definition be put in. We have been accused of challenging the very foundation of science by proposing such a radical, unheard of definition, and it just amazes me that anybody would think that's not a definition of science. That's what I've been doing for 25 years, and that's what it is. The third point, permit critical analysis of controversial issues. Here, this is in the introduction. This is embodied in the Santorum Amendment. This was passed by the U.S. Senate and included in the No Child Left Behind Conference report. This is language that suggests that, or actually that directs, I can't do that one by memory either. The conferees recognize, and this is the language we would like in the introduction, that a quality science education should prepare students to distinguish the data and testable theories of science from religious or philosophical claims that are made in the name of science. Where topics are taught that may generate controversy, such as biological evolution, the curriculum should help students to understand the full range of scientific views that exist, why such topics may generate controversy, and how scientific discoveries can profoundly affect society. And we would ask that that language be put in just to give a sense in the Kansas standards that we agree with that attitude. Number 4, acknowledge major unanswered questions. There are many unanswered questions in science. We think it's important that students recognize that science is not a closed book, that there's nothing left to do, that there are many things that are challenging, and these are the deep questions, the origin of the universe, origin of the fundamental laws of the universe. Where did gravity come from? Where did the mass of an electron come from? Where life came from, where the diversity of life. These are deep questions that still need to be answered, and science has no good answer for them at this point. 8th grade, evolution is a theory. Here, there had been some effort to remove the word, and successful effort, I might add, to remove the word theory from biological evolution. And we think that it's clear that evolution, Darwinian evolution, macroevolution, and chemical evolution, which of course is not part of Darwinism, but is part of the greater overarching evolutionary perspective. Those are theories and need to remain as theories. To teach them as fact is irresponsible. 8th grade historical sciences. Children need to understand that there is a fundamental difference between the conclusions we draw from historical sciences. Where did things come from? How did things come to be? versus what we'll call, for lack of a better word, operational or maybe experimental, empirical sciences, where most of the variables are controllable and they operate in the real world today. So historical sciences are very different than operational sciences, and students need to understand it. Institutional bias, we've discussed that bias can exist in institutions. We recommend teaching historical sciences. This is a little bit more depth at the higher grades. Nucleotide sequence is not determined by, are you trying to tell me something, John?
Whoops. Excuse me.
It's fine if you want me to know. I won't say that. We have inserted in the area of genetics that the nucleotide sequence, the sequence of bases in DNA, is not determined by any law, and that is a profound mystery.